It's a good day. This is one of our favorite days of the year, so thank you all for coming. It's fun. I think this is our fourth year in a row. So I tell you how much I love coming here and the whole weekend. Like, we have a tradition, the teachers that are appointed teachers in the Midwest that plan this and put it on every Friday night. We have a meal together, and James's wife, Jennifer, makes us an amazing Middle Eastern meal every year. And she tops herself every year. So much so that yesterday I'm on the way here, and the airline is offering $900 in cash to bump flights to later in the evening. But I wouldn't have gotten into Chicago until 10:30. And I was like, no, too bad. I'm going to this meal. So, how much what? Oh, internally my price was $1,500. If they got to $1,500, I'm like, Jen, sorry, make me a plate. I'll be there later this evening. Now, I need you all to do me a favor for the good of my marriage. Don't tell my wife that I turned down $900 because she loves taking, in fact, she goes to the airport hoping that we'll get bumped. She's like, I hope they bump us. We are so going to stay here for a few hours. So don't tell her that. I do get to teach today. I'm going to introduce him now. He'll come up in a little while, but my friend, and I'm not all Frenchy, like Jeremy is, but Gilbert, yeah. But it's Gilbert Kimeng. Gilbert was born in Cameroon, which is a beautiful country in West Africa. He was converted in Germany in the campus ministry there. He spent some time in the ministry in the Côte d'Ivoire, which is also in Western Africa, or if you've never heard of that and you're looking at me weird, that's the Ivory Coast. And then he is currently in Nigeria with his beautiful wife, and they just adopted a son. They have a 5-month-old son, Joseph. And Gilbert last August, right? August, was, along with two other friends of ours, Fred George and Emmanuel Eme, were the first 3 guys in our family of churches appointed teachers on the continent of Africa. And it's actually pretty exciting because I think there's a very good possibility that by the end of this year we will have somewhere in the range of 7 more teachers across Africa appointed this year and bring us like to the realm of 10. So that's pretty cool. But Gilbert will always be first. So, right? No, it's good to, in years past we've done, I think Jeremy mentioned this, we've kind of had a specific theme, and even though in some ways a theme has developed, today, Gilbert and I are going to stray away from the theme a little bit. We've been a little more of a spiritual formation theme. And that's an important part of teaching, I think, is helping us go deeper, helping us analyze an element of our faith or understanding about God or His Word, and maybe breaking it down, going a little deeper and learning how to approach it. But I think there's also an element of teaching that needs to be a bit on the prophetic side, a bit on the here's where we're going, and we've got to see the signs here, or we're going to drive into some trouble if we don't pay attention to what's going on. And so we're going to get into that a little bit today here in this session. Now, when I was when I was a much younger man, in my 30s, there was a time I remember when my son, my oldest son, some of you know him, Paviel, he was probably about 7 years old. And I remember there was one night, my wife was at work. She's a nurse, and so overnight she was at work. And this sort of thing always seemed to happen when she was gone. And in the middle of the night, I kind of woke up and I heard these steps coming up these footsteps coming up the steps. And I kind of like what's that? And then I laid back down and I heard him go, "Dad." And I reacted like any loving parent was. I said, "Don't you dare." And he came up around the corner. I was like, "Don't you?" And he was like, "Dad, I don't feel good." And I was like, "No, no." And he came at the bed and I was like, "You better not stop." And he went, "Wah," like that. And projectile vomited all over the bed and me. And it's the middle of the night. So now I have to get up with vomit all over myself, clean off my bed, disinfect everything, get him, I got him cleaned up too, Look, you're on your own, kid. I had to go hose him off, clean him up, get him to bed, then go up, take everything off, and take care of it, and it was unbelievable. Now, a couple years later, we have another son. And there was a day where, again, my wife was at work. There's a pattern here. And it was my job. I had to get him up. I was still a high school teacher at the time. I had to get him up, take him to daycare. So he's like 1.5 at this time, probably 1.5. Take him to daycare and get him on his way. So I remember one day in particular, I had like on very light cream pants, a light colored shirt. And I'm like, okay, I got just enough time to grab him and take him to daycare. And so I opened the door. And my wife used to sometimes, we were not above bribery. So if to get him to go to sleep, she would take like a cookie and be like, "Now I'm going to put the cookie here on your dresser. And if you're a good boy and you go to sleep, you can have the cookie in the morning when you wake up." So I walked in, I opened the door and I was like, "Oh, did she give him, he's got chocolate all over the place." So I went to the crib and I was like, "That's not chocolate." I'm telling you. There was a blowout, and it was all on the mattress crib, all on the slats. He was doing poop art, okay? They were just finger painting on the wall. And he's just grinning away. He's got it on his nose and, everywhere. And I was like, "You are kidding me." So there was another, impromptu shower session, hosing, you're like this. And he's wiping it on me as we're going. And I'm like, this is unbelievable. I want him having to change my own clothes, hose him off, clean it all down. Because I'm like, I can't have my wife walking into that after a night shift, And I was a little late getting to work. And so those are parts of parenthood, right? Yeah. Now, if you would have come to me at 15 or 16 years old and said, "You will sign up for a job where people will vomit on you, wipe their poop on you, sneeze on you, spit on you, do all these," there's no way I'm doing that. Get me out of there. So why would I be willing to put up with that? Because somehow, in some unexplainable way, they give you this kid, which you thought was a good idea, right? And then you hold this kid and you're just filled with like, okay, I love this thing. I would do anything for this thing in a way that I don't really understand, right? And so all the terrible what's, the vomit, the poop, the snot, all of that, are outweighed by this huge why. Right? And the why powers you through the difficult what's. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay. And if you lose track of the why, the what's start becoming bigger than the why, and that becomes a problem. Because when you're going through difficult what's, if your why's not bigger, you give up on the what's. Okay? Keep that in mind as we go today. And we're going to talk about some elements of culture, the power of culture, and how it impacts us in the church. It's not something, I'll tell you right up front, that I think we can ignore. Yeah. It's not something that we put to the side. It's not something that like, oh, well, that's one of those side issues. We need to focus on what's important. I'm going to make the case, Gilbert and I are going to make the case today, that it is at the heart of what we do, okay? Let's start with, and we're going to look at 3 simple elements here. There's a 4th one, but we're just going to look at 3 for our purposes today. The first one is understanding why are we here? Why did God make us? And we could do a whole day just on this topic, on any one of these topics. So I'm just going to introduce this here for a moment. But I will say, as the screen says, our purpose in creation is to be image bearers. This is what the Bible tells us. It's the conversation that God has with the divine council in Genesis 1. Should we make man in our image? Hey, I got an idea. Let's make human in our image. Now that means a whole lot more than just so that humans will look like God, or even not so much carry some of the characteristics of God. But the word as it was used is really, in all of Genesis 1, is using this temple imagery from the ancient Near East. And it's this idea of creating a temple that looked like the creation, that mimics creation, and then they would place a statue of the God inside that temple. And that statue was the reflection of the God's will. It mediated the will and the rule of the God in his space. And so what Genesis 1 is getting across is that the whole world, whatever you can imagine, whatever you know of it, whether it's this big or it's this big, that's God's space. He made it, and it's his space. And he took human. He didn't take a statue that was made of wood or gold or whatever. He took human, and he put it in this temple, in his space, to represent and reflect and do his will. That's our purpose, right? Now, that's a higher calling than the other creatures that he made as described in day 6. The most that they can do is follow their instinct and do what is best, what's in their self-interest, right? I have a dog, he's stupid. He's brick dumb. But this dog, all he can do is what he wants. And I've said this many times. I've owned this dog for 12 years now. Never once has he come to me and said, "What do you need today? What can I do for you?" He doesn't have that level of consciousness. So actually, when human beings start living for ourselves and what we want, and putting ourselves first, our own interests first, we're actually acting like beasts. That's the realm of beasts. Our realm is to do God's will. And it's to live in harmony and unity with one another, reflecting the rule and reign of God, spreading out around the world and caring for his creation as interwoven groups of human beings working together and reflecting God's will. Yes. That's our purpose. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's what it's supposed to look like. But of course in Genesis, that project goes off kilter because man does what? Takes the realm of the beast. Right? I'm going to go my own way. And that's the cause of division. It's the cause of all the hate and the inners and the intras and all of that junk that we see in the world is because we took, and that's what Genesis 3 depicts so beautifully. The human that was supposed to rule over and care for the creation is now being duped by it. It's now entering into the realm of the beast. The beast is taking the upper hand. And human is doing what the beast is supposed to do, and now there's this reversal. That's the picture, okay? And so we lose that, and we're created with differences. God gave it. We're different people groups, different skin colors, different cultures, different whatever. But instead of working together in harmony to reflect God's will throughout the creation, because we enter the realm of the beast, these differences become division. And that breaks up our purpose, which I have a clicker. I keep walking over here. There we go. Which leads us to the second part then, is God's response to us breaking the purpose for which we are made as image bearers is to create the mission. The mission is pretty simple. He comes to Abraham in Genesis 12. Now, what's right before the story of Abraham? Babel, right? And Babel, once again, humanity for the second time in the book already in 11 chapters, rebels against God's plan. God says, go fill the earth, subdue it, do what you're supposed to be doing. And humans rebel in a different way than they did in chapter 3. This time we're going to stick together and we're going to control the divine realm. We're going to do it our way. And God says, okay, that's an even more dangerous rebellion than the first one. I'm going to have to split you up. And you know, when we stand at weddings sometimes and we'll say, what God has joined together, let no man tear asunder, right? Well, the opposite's true too. What God tears apart, let no man try to put back together. So God says, I'm going to separate humanity for your own protection right now. But then the very next chapter, he comes to Abraham and says, but no, I'm going to put this back together. I'm going to use you to bless and bring back together the nations. Humans will try to do it, but they won't be able to, no matter how hard they try, because I'm the one who broke it up. And so when I bring it back together, you'll know that it's me. And for thousands of years, humans will try in different ways to conquer the world, to bring it together, to become the king of the world, and they won't be able to. Right? And so that's the promise. And we could look at it in many different ways, or verses, but I'll just show you one in Isaiah 66:18. And it's all throughout the Old Testament, but it says, and I, because of what they have planned and done, am about to come and gather the people of all nations and languages, and they will come and see my glory. He says, I will gather the nations. Now, I want to do this for a second here. I want to write a couple of sentences down. And I want you to, after I write this, just kind of look at this sentence for a minute, take it in, meditate on it. Okay? Now, I want you to look at this second one, and I want you to notice what it has in common. Don't call it out yet. But what are some commonalities with the first sentence? Can everybody see that? Okay? You got it? Okay? Now, what is something these two sentences have in common?
You're going to be the one performing the act.
Okay, I'm going to perform an act. What else? Homicide. A crime would seem to be committed. Now I'm going to write a third sentence. Now, what do those three sentences have in common? Action, what?
Future tense.
Future tense, okay. There's not a period. Right? They weren't complete. It wasn't the full thought. Now, you wouldn't have known that with the first two ones, but you should know that with the third one. Because it's a very different sentence. I'm going to shoot my sons versus I'm going to shoot my sons a text tonight. I'm going to smother my wife. Well, that's 10 to 20. With attention, that's a marriage retreat. Right? Go make disciples is not the fulfillment of any promise in the Old Testament. It's not the mission. And it can get us off track if we think it is. And we know the whole passage, but oftentimes we shorthand it down to go make disciples. But the whole thought, and then of course it goes on baptizing them and all that, but that's sort of subsequent to the mission, which is go make disciples of all nations. That's in response to what God promised Abraham. That's in response to Isaiah 2. The nations will stream in. That's Isaiah 66. I will gather the nations. This is Jesus standing there going, the thing that God has been promising since Abraham, it's happening right now. Since Babel, it's happening right now. The time has come. What God tore apart, he is about to put back together, and he's the only one who can do it. But if I think that it's just go make disciples, then it becomes about growth. We can go grow, and it doesn't matter. And there's a thing that's very popular in some evangelical circles. It's called the HUP theory. Homogeneous unit principle. And that means the most effective way to build a church is to get people like you, one group, one socioeconomic group, one racial group, one age group, one whatever, and then focus on that as your target audience and grow, grow, grow. And you know what? It works. And it works well. And you can get huge mega churches doing that. But that's not the gospel. That's easier. It's more effective. It's not the gospel. It's easier to be with people like me. People think because I speak a lot about culture, oh, you must know all cultures. No, I have no idea about Asian cultures. I've never been over to Asia. Oh, you must be super culturally flexible. No, actually, I'm like super rigid. Like, I don't enjoy other cultural things, right? It's difficult for me. But my why is this is the mission God has given us. And it will push through the difficult whats because it's harder to be a diverse group. It just is. It's because culture's difficult and it's easy to go back to sort of our people, right? But we've got to know that it's about making disciples of all nations. That's our identity. That's the mission. That's what we've been called to. And if you see a homogeneous group, it is not an answer to Babel. It's part of it. So then that leads us to the third element, and I'm going to describe this quickly, and then Gilbert's going to come up. The task we have in that, God won't do it all for us, right? He has given us the mission, but there is a task that we have. And it's described, I'm not going to read it now, but you know the passage in 1 Corinthians 9, 19 through 23. Paul says, to the Jew, I became like the Jew. To this group, I became like that group. I have become all things to all people so that I might save as many as possible. Paul understands that the mission to gather the nations can break down really quickly if we don't engage in it intentionally. If we don't pay attention to the power of culture. They've done studies over time and shown that particularly in the United States, but I think that the principle is similar around the world. But there have been multiracial movements. There have been diverse movements. And almost all of them have fallen apart after a generation or two. They start out really great, they go well, and then they fall apart. And I believe that the primary reason is because they do not pay attention to the task given us within the mission, which is to learn about culture, which is to pay attention to it, which is to be able to be all things to all people, which is to be inclusive, to send the constant message that you're welcome and you're included and your voice needs to be heard. And if you don't pay attention to that, there becomes a default culture, which is the dominant culture of wherever you live. And then that will just steamroll everything else. And the message that will be sent is, you're welcome as long as you come in and act like me. And that gets old after a generation or two for people. They're like, okay, I believe this, I wanted to live it out, but why do I always have to be the one to sacrifice my culture? Meanwhile, you're standing there saying, we don't pay attention to anything like culture, we just follow the gospel. Yeah, that's because your culture is king. And everyone else is having to sacrifice. And after a while, they'll go, forget this. And there will be a frustration. That makes sense? Okay? And I tell people this, if you go in, and I'm not saying everything is perfect your way, but if you go to a church where culturally everything feels comfortable and normal, then you might have a church that is multiracial but not multicultural. Because being all things to all people will mean that there's going to be some discomfort for you. There's going to be some times where you're bending and not doing it your way, and you're doing things that are uncomfortable to you because it's comfortable to the person next to you. Right. Because if you're diverse, that is demanded in the mission to gather the nations. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Now, the world has a strategy for diversity too, right? Does anybody know that it's a virtue now. It's the great word of diversity. It starts with a T. Tolerance. Right? Tolerance. That's a good thing, tolerance. Isn't it? I will tolerate other groups. I will tolerate you. I will show tolerance. You show tolerance. And the only thing I'm going to be, not be tolerant of is people who are intolerant. Then I can be intolerant of the intolerant, because that fights against tolerance. But tolerance doesn't really demand anything of me. It just means I have no expectation or standards. It just means I'll let you do whatever you do. You can do your thing. What the Bible calls us to is so much more revolutionary and so much more transformational and so much more difficult. Instead of toleration, it calls us to participation. It calls us to inclusion. Instead of, Gilbert, you do kind of, when we worship, you do sort of your African things, but you go ahead over there and do it. Instead, that's toleration. Participation is, you know what? Let me join in with you. Let's worship. Yes, there you go, Phil. Let's do this together. Show me how you do it, because I want you to feel like we really want all of you, not just your skin color, to make us look diverse and trendy. Right? Because that's the message that's sent. I want you for your skin color or your, whatever difference it is, but not really for your influence. Because I don't want to be uncomfortable. But that's demanded by being all things to all people. That's participation. Culture is powerful. If we let it, it will divide us. It's just, that's the nature of it. It's a group of people acting in a way that's normal for them. This is how we act. But if you get another group of people, they're going to have a different normal. And so we'll separate, because then it's like, you're not normal, and we stay away from each other. So to come together, we have this huge task of like, man, how do we do this? How do we become all things to all people? Gilbert is going to come up. I'm going to try to not move all the furniture. And Gilbert's going to come up and share with us a little bit some stories of culture, and then I'll come back up and finish this up with some thoughts.
Excellent. I just want to start out by sharing one of my journals. And I know Martina mentioned me writing journals and sharing with disciples back in Nigeria. So this one was written Journal 21st October 2018. And the title was Dealing with, in quotes, Legitimate Anger. That was the title of the journal. I just read. It's becoming more evident to me that I grew up in a pretty angry society. My entire generation felt cheated and deprived of its sovereign rights. From a very early age, most of us dreamt of leaving the country in search of better pastures. That's Cameroon. As Michael mentioned, I was born in Cameroon. I remember a mentor and friend, that's Hervé Florent, for those who know him, looking at my pictures, my photo album. That's when I moved to Abidjan to serve full-time. and noticing that I was very uptight in most of the pictures. He even pointed out that my fists were clenched, like that of a boxer, and asked me why. At that time, I attributed what he described on one of the pictures to the sadness that hovered over us as a family due to the sudden and tragic death of my older brother. He went to bed at night and never got up the following morning. In addition to that, I personally never got the opportunity to experience the closure that comes with taking part in the burial of a loved one. He died in Lagos, that's where I am now, was buried in my mother's village in Eket. My mom is from Nigeria, though she grew up in Cameroon. But my uncle kept the news from me until he was buried. Today, this is when I was writing, 21st October, with the current Anglophone, Francophone crisis in Cameroon, I'm going to say more about that later, I'm coming to a deep realization that my entire generation grew up feeling the sting of injustice, deprived of educational opportunities and a fair share of national wealth. I'm reminded of the rantings of a major opposition leader who for several minutes vented his anger during a tete-a-tete I was privileged to have with him as a missionary over a decade ago. I'd met him because of my concern for civil or national peace. And I went on now in my journal to conclude, it's dawning on me anew that Jesus' life and example is the only real source of hope and healing for such a generation as mine. His story teaches me that life on this side of eternity is not meant to be just. How I am treated is less critical than my response to the unjust treatment. Now, I ended up by saying, does my story strike any chords in you? Maybe it's awakened old wounds incurred by some unjust treatment, either in recent times or in the past. There is a way out. Let's continuously look up to Jesus for healing and for a heart of forgiveness. And a journal will end up with some scriptures, 1 Peter 2, Isaiah 53, Hebrews 12. So this was an excerpt from one of my journals. But this describes what's going on right now in Cameroon. So Cameroon is the reverse of Canada. Canada has majority English-speaking, right? And the French-speaking a minority, right? In Cameroon is the exact reverse. Cameroon has 10, we could call it 10 states. They call it province, or now they call it now regions. So out of the 10, just 2 are English-speaking, and 8 are French-speaking. So it's dominated by the French-speaking part of Cameroon. The politics, everything is dominated. And the anger I described here growing up came from the fact that my father, for example, worked in an oil refinery where I grew up, in the English-speaking part of Cameroon. But I'll tell you, like 95% of the employees, those who worked there, were from the French-speaking part of Cameroon. But in English-speaking soil. And I mean, the English-speaking part of Cameroon could not benefit from that. And this is just an example, and it spreads across so many other areas. So this is a country made up of blacks. It's not a race, white-black issue, okay? And there's so much division. Right now, there's intense civil war going on in Cameroon. Because the English-speaking guys have gotten to a point they're like, enough is enough. We want to be independent. We need our own republic. Wow. And in the French part, so they're now considered as rebels, and they even call them guerrillas, all kinds. So there's some real fighting and killing. But it's unfortunate because you don't see it in the news. But it's actually happening right now. So that's where I grew up. So this is division, like Michael described, caused by majorly language. French English. And French English, for a bit of history, the way the French colonized Africa is very different from the way the English did. So I've been privileged to live in those parts of Africa, born in Cameroon, became a disciple in Germany, went to serve full-time in Abidjan for 10 full years. That's French Africa. And then I've been in Lagos now for 9 years. That's English-speaking West Africa. And I've gotten to now learn a lot more about the cultural psyche of the people. And what I've discovered, for example, when the French colonized, their method is assimilation. So you got to speak like them, you got to eat like them, you got to walk like them, you got to do everything like them. But the English didn't do that. The English were interested in whatever they want to get from you, but they'll allow you with your culture. So if you go to a church service in Abidjan, Michael has been there many times, this place is hot, there's intense heat, people are sweating, but you'll notice that most of the brothers or the leaders, they're all suited up. I mean, suited up with tie, and it's hot. You see what culture does? Very French. But if you go to Nigeria or Ghana, for example, on a Sunday service, I remember moving to Nigeria, and I showed up like a French man, and the one I was dating back then, who is now my wife, that's why I moved to Nigeria, she was like, "Are you going to the office?" I was doing what is really cool in Abidjan, but it's not cool in Lagos. In Lagos, what's really cool on a Sunday is to wear traditional, dress in African tradition, and that's what I wear now. So my suits are wasting in Lagos. I can count the number of times I wear a suit in Lagos. Because it's a different dynamic. But the roots of all of that even dates all the way back to colonization. So the English will take whatever they want, but they allow you with your culture. And then this alone, I was telling Michael this morning, let's be honest with you, I was in Abidjan for 10 years, but I'm glad I left at some point. Because I mean, it got really difficult culturally at some point. Okay, so here we are. I'm talking Africa. I'm not talking white, black. I'm talking. I mean, within African regions. I mean, are we talking Nigeria and Ghana? That's another dynamic. These are two English-speaking countries, and to be honest with you, Nigeria actually kind of like oversees the work in English-speaking Africa. But there's been a lot of resistance, even with our missions, between those two nations, where Nigerians often were the ones either leading the church and stuff like that. But it got to a point where Ghanaians are like, enough is enough. And like, until I had to have a corporate conversation with a top CEO of a corporate body in Ghana. This is a telecom company, really huge. Met her in her home with her husband, and we're having a conversation. She thought I was coming from Congo. And then when I now revealed that no, because it's a brother from Congo who introduced me to her. Then when she discovered I'm a Nigerian, she must have trusted me enough, and now she opened up. She said, "Oh man, Nigerians?" He said, "Look, at the workplace, what we think about Nigerians as Ghanaians, wherever they come, they want to show, they want to prove that they know. They want to be the first. They want to dominate and all whatnot. So there's a serious cultural thing going on there. To the point where there's even one in history, there was a time when Ghanaians threw Nigerians out of Ghana. And then some time later, the Nigerians actually did the same thing and threw the Ghanaians out of Nigeria. Till date, there is a traveling bag that people use to carry stuff and travel. It can contain a lot of stuff. They call the bag Ghana Must Go. Wow. And I never knew where that name came from until I learned about the history. It came from that experience where Ghanaians were sent out of Nigeria. And the term, maybe they quickly had to take their stuff and fill into those bags and leave. Yeah. And this is just two nations, English-speaking nations in West Africa, and this is going on. Is it Germany where I became a disciple? That's another story right there. in terms of culture. And let me reveal something to you. I had a conversation with Peju, who's a sister in Minneapolis. Knew her in Europe, she's Nigerian. We had a conversation around even some kind of cultural tension between Germans and Americans. And who knows if history has to do with that. Okay? Okay? So, I mean, you could take it from any angle. East Africa, between Kenyans and Tanzanians, the dynamic between the two nations is very similar to the dynamic I just described between Nigeria and Ghana. So Kenyans are like the aggressive people in East Africa, and the Tanzanians are viewed as a bit laid back, and they have all kinds of issues between those two, to the extent that if not for the church and the kingdom, it would be very difficult to intermarry. Within Nigeria itself, we have 3 major tribes in Nigeria. You have the Hausas in the north, you have the Igbos, and then you have the Yorubas. So the Igbos are a lot more, they're traders, they're very successful in business. Then the Yorubas, Lagos is a Yoruba area. When I moved to Lagos, boy, oh boy, it was a serious cultural shock. Like in the Yoruba culture, for example, respect for elders is so intense that people literally, when you see an elderly person, they literally go down on their knees. Literally. And bow. And whoever doesn't do that is perceived as disrespectful. And so for me, initially, I was like, are we not worshiping people here? And to be honest with you, I even had some conflict within the church with some elderly people who felt like I was rude. And I had to learn the hard way. Oh, it took a while. So I'm just painting all these different scenarios to say, we got to be, just like the world talks about emotional intelligence, I think there's also cultural intelligence. And we need to take into consideration as we go about carrying out the mission. I just wanted to share a few of those stories. Thank you very much.
I should have been closer to the front. Thanks so much, Gilbert. It's a joy to have Gilbert here. He was here last week in Minneapolis teaching a course on the New Testament at our School of Missions there, which is pretty cool because in our family of churches, it's the first time ever that we've had an African teacher come to the United States and teach at a ministry training academy over here. So hopefully it'll be the first of many and get, the flow going always. So we're excited and this is Gilbert's first time in the United States. So I think he's enjoying it, right? I mean, we very quickly when he arrived, I took him to the 2 most important things that you have to experience in the United States, Chipotle and Subway. We got those out of the way. So, come on. He loved it. He loved it. Now, the power of what Gilbert shared and the importance of it is sometimes in the United States, when you talk about culture, we can almost think that it's code word for the black-white issue. Right. Now, that's a big aspect of it. I'm not going to deny that. And many of you know we go around and do workshops that bring in that dynamic. And I wrote the book, Crossing Line, Culture, Race, and Kingdom. But culture and culture divides cut across that. You have, as Gilbert shared, cultural issues between different white folk groups, between different groups and tribes in Africa that are the same, and it's the same all around the world. We can, and there's many streams of culture, so we can share some cultural streams with some people and then have different aspects of our culture that can cause conflict. And if we don't pay attention to culture, it can cause a lot of problems and we won't even be aware of it. And we won't be aware that it's culture that's causing the conflict. We'll think it's about something else. Okay? I'll talk about that in just a second. I'm going to finish up here. What happens if we don't pay attention to culture? Now, let me say this, and this is my own count, but Paul, if you add up all of Paul's writings, he has about a little over 2,000. It's like 2,034 verses in all of Paul's writings, right? How many verses do you think Paul wrote directly about the topic of marriage and directing on marriage? Anyone want to guess? 15? All right. It's 3? It's actually a big number. 68 verses in Paul's writings, he deals with marriage. Okay? And then if we look in comparison, how many times does Paul write about the gathering of the nations, teaching about that topic, teaching about cultural intelligence, being all things to all people, that area? 634 verses. It was the primary thing because Paul knew if you understand the mission, that one of the primary tasks of the church is to keep it together in being all things to all people. The mission is the why, but the all things to all people is part of the what. And there's a lot of difficult whats, right? And things, again, we could have different views of authority, as Gilbert mentioned, and that can cause a conflict. We can have different views of respect. We can have different ways of communication. I could be in a relationship with a brother of the same race, and I could be from a direct communication culture and he indirect, and it causes conflict. And he walks away thinking that brother's unloving and unspiritual, and I can't be in a relationship with him. And the cause is cultural, but now we're trying to address spiritual things, and we're not going to get to the cause if we just communicate differently. And we've got to learn how to do that. You have, we get mixed, a diverse church. Let's say you have a church that's, for right now, I'll just say you have a good population of white folks and a good population of black folks. Not to ignore the other groups, but I'm trying to make it a simple illustration, right? And an event happens in the news, a tragic event that involves maybe a police officer and a young person of color being shot, and we know how passionate those sorts of, they can cause passion. Well, you have traditionally white folks coming from a church culture that says you don't talk about political issues or controversial issues or things in the news at church. You go to church to get away from those things. That's why you'll often hear the preacher say, I know you got a lot going on in your mind, but just clear your mind of all that's going on in the world and we're going to focus on God. And so that's the culture. So you come thinking, I know the one thing we're not going to do is talk about what's in the news. But traditionally, the culture of the black church is you do talk about those things. For goodness sakes, that's the only place sometimes you can. It's the one place you can come and be honest and open and safe and talk about how do we deal with the junk going on out there and where's the justice of God and how do we approach life. And so we do bring those things and talk about them because God touches every area of life. And so now we come to church together on Sunday morning with two very different sets of cultural expectation. And the leadership group, which is often in our family of churches, sort of the default dominant white culture without thinking, says we're not going to address that because that's not what you do. There's not a conscious decision to ignore something. It's just a cultural assumption being played out. And now you come together on Sunday morning and a large portion of the church walks away and go, oh, they didn't talk about it. You know why? Because they don't care about us. They don't care what we go through. They're so out of touch. And it starts to take on a racial conflict when the cause is a simple cultural assumption. Now, that's not to say that the solution is simple, right? But if you know the cause, you can start to talk about it and deal with it. Does that make sense? So there is how many times am I going to walk into this table? Let's bring in some wine and start having a drinking game here. All right. So real quick, what happens if we ignore this task? Number one, there will be a growing frustration of people in the non-dominant culture. And people that, it's kind of like the whole colorblind game. Well, I don't see color. Yeah, that's because you're on top. And so it's really easy for you to claim that. That's a way to keep everything in place. We don't have to talk about color. Yeah, because you have all the advantages and privileges, right? It would be like if we took everybody that was left-handed and say, we're going to keep all the left-handers out of this room, or say it's a sports event. No left-handers can buy tickets or season tickets to the game. And so then we sell all the season tickets, and then later we go and say, oh, you know what, that wasn't a good rule. Anybody can buy season tickets, but they're all sold already. So then we go, anybody can buy season tickets. What are you complaining about? Yeah, because nobody that's left-handed has any, because the rules changed after everything was right. And so it's easy for the dominant culture to go, I don't think we need to talk about culture. Yeah, because yours is the default. And so you're not being all things to all people. You are being unbiblical if you're not paying attention to this topic. Recently, the rapper Lecrae, do you know him? Yeah. Like the beast of Christian rap. He's the biggest guy out there. Actually came out with an article last year and said, I am divorcing the white evangelical church. I'm done with it. And he said, because they will not pay attention to the issues and cultural perspectives of my people. And he said, and I'm tired of it. The message is loud and clear. You can be Christian as long as you come in to act white. And so he actually has intentionally walked away. That will happen if we don't pay attention to this issue. And believe me, I've talked to plenty of people who are like, I'm so frustrated and so close to just going because they've lost sight of the why and giving up on the what. And that's why we've got to constantly preach about this gathering of the nations and then act on it, being all things to all people. The second thing is, the second aspect of this, if we don't pay attention to it, is the dominant culture will think everything is fine and we don't need to talk about it. Everything's fine. You're making an issue out of nothing. No, what it is people just don't talk around you because you're not culturally humble. Because there will be things that will be said when you're not around if you don't go and ask. Do you ever feel like an other here? I talked recently with a guy who is on track to be an elder in his church. And he said, man, I think about leaving about once a month. I stay here because I know this is God's plan. But culturally, it is like going to a different planet every single Sunday. That's not a place where you ever feel connected fully. Like, you have friends, you love people, but there's always that tug of like, but I'm not completely welcome here. That's what Paul calls for, all things to all people. We can be diverse, but not multicultural. One of my friends on the Cultural Unity and Diversity team said, slave plantations were diverse. Diversity means nothing if there's not inclusion. When we first came to Milwaukee Church of Christ 20-some years ago, we walked in, we saw racial diversity, my wife and I, and we were like, whoa, we've never seen this before. This is it. The generation now, they see racial diversity almost everywhere. They walk in and they go, eh. You know what they're looking for? Multicultural inclusion. Is this just another white church with brown people in it? Or is it something truly unique? Right? That's the challenge, is people walk in and go, what is this? Is it a white church? Is it a Latino church? Is it a black church? It's kind of all of those things. And we'll have an International Sunday once a year. Woo! Every single Sunday should be that. That should just be a normal part of the gathering of the nations, isn't it? Because we're focused on who God wants us to be and not limited to just who we are. So there has to be an intention there. As I mentioned, if we don't pay attention to culture, we will open ourselves up to constant conflicts and not know the cause. We will miss what's going on and be running around chasing our tails and not solving the heart of the issues. And I think about 75% of our conflicts are culturally based. If we ignore the power of culture, I think we will be neglecting an important part of the gospel. It is to gather the nations, and that implies the being all things to all people. I'll end with this. One of the things when the book Crossing the Line, Culture, Race, and Kingdom came out, we spent the last couple of years doing workshops around with that. One of the things that came up quite a bit was churches would come back and go, that was a great start. We now realize we need to grow in our cultural humility, our cultural intelligence, our cultural inclusion, being all things to all people. How do we do that? Right? I just felt like Joel Peed there for a minute doing this. How do we do that? That was a Joel Peed thing, right? Am I right? Kind of? Come on. That's cultural. But how do we do that? And so I just finished up, and we have coming out this year, and so I mention it because you might be sitting there going, great, now how do we do that? I just finished a book called, and not that I have all the answers, but I've tried to think through a lot of these things, and it's a book called All Things to All People. And helping a church become or move on to the journey towards cultural humility and cultural competence. There's 4 sections to the book. The first section is kind of about some of the things we talked about today, the purpose, the mission, the task, and the one that we left out was the covering of loving others. And then there's a second section that gets into culture. What is culture? How does it divide us? That expands on that. And then the third section tries to go through specific things, communication styles, East versus West, music, and all kinds of, there's 8 or 10 different things, generation gaps and things that can cause cultural divides in the church, how they can cause divides, how we can address it, and then specifically how the Bible directs us in those areas to come together and blend together instead of just a default dominant culture into the new transformed kingdom culture in that area where we include all of it. And then the fourth area is specifically, the fourth section is, how do I become a culturally competent person? How do we develop a culturally competent leadership? And how do we become a culturally competent church? And then there's also a workbook that'll be about 100 pages where each chapter will have self-reflection questions, discussion questions, and then group activities, learning activities that are kind of games and fun and discussion-based for your church to engage in, to develop some of the skills and be aware of some of those things. I can't quite give you a release date yet, but it will be before summer. I think it will be out. So so I just throw that out there as a tool. For the discussion questions today, we tried to keep it simple. Sorry we don't have some of the really awesome detailed questions that the other guys had, and they were great. We have 3 simple questions, so you have time to kind of dig into each one and share and discuss. And if you have any questions, feel free. Gilbert will be here the rest of the day. Feel free to talk to me. I have to, as soon as I get done speaking right now, I have to order my Uber and go to the airport. So I won't be here. But thank you all.